Well, Ron Paul is kicking ass. In Iowa, he's up to #1. Latest polls have him at 23%, Romney at 20%, Gingrich all the way down to 14%. So what is happening? Well, the establishment is losing it. They can't stand this phenomenon. Now, I'm going to give you one of Ron Paul's ads here for two reasons. One is to show you that I'm not necessarily a Ron Paul supporter at all. I agree with him on half the stuff. We've talked about it, civil liberties, defense, etc. What you're going to see is both why Ron Paul is beginning to win in Iowa and why I can't fully support him. So let's watch this ad first.
What's up with these sorry politicians? Lots of bark. When it's showtime, whimpering like little shih tzus. You want big cuts? Ron Paul's been screaming it for years. Budget crisis? No problem. Got $1 trillion year one. That's trillion with a T. Department of Education? Gone. Interior, Energy, HUD, Commerce? Gone. Later, bureaucrats. That's how Ron Paul rolls. Want to drain the swamp? Ron Paul. Do it.
I'm Ron Paul, and I approve this message.
I don't want to blow up the Department of Education. I don't want to go, pfft, right? So I want you to understand that this is not a segment we're doing because I love Ron Paul or I'm a big supporter of Ron Paul. But you got to call things as they are. And when you look at how the establishment is treating him, especially among Republicans and on Fox News, it's an absolute injustice. Let's start with Bill O'Reilly. He was on the Today Show. This is what he says about Ron Paul.
Ron Paul.
His foreign policy disqualifies him in my eyes as an American, not as a journalist. But, you know, I don't think we need another Neville Chamberlain with Iran. And, you know, so he wants to be friends with Iran as well.
#1 in Iowa, #2 in New Hampshire. It doesn't matter. Fox News is going to disqualify him. Why? Because O'Reilly thinks his policy on Iran is terrible. Really? But while he was interviewing Mitt Romney, here's what Bill O'Reilly had to say about Iran and the idea of attacking it. Watch.
You're a tough guy. You're going to stare them down and say, look, I'm going to use them? Because if you bomb Iran, that starts World War III. You know that. I mean, they're going to try to block Hormuz. Oil will double. The unintended consequences all against the United States all over the Muslim world will be horrible. That's what Iran is banking on.
So you know what? It turns out Bill O'Reilly actually doesn't want to attack Iran. He doesn't disqualify Ron Paul based on that. He agrees with Ron Paul, actually, on that issue. The thing is, Fox News and the rest of the conservative establishment and the Republicans, they're desperate to disqualify Ron Paul for any reason. By the way, what's the real reason? It's because he might end the corruption in Washington. And those guys feed off and live on that corruption. Now, when you go inside the state of Iowa, Politico had an interesting article. In fact, the headline is Paul Panic Seizes Iowa Establishment. And that is very accurate. Look at this quote from Becky Beach. She's an Iowa Republican who worked for both Bushes. It would make the caucuses mostly irrelevant, if not entirely irrelevant, if Ron Paul wins. It would have a very damaging effect because I don't think he could be elected president. So, and both Iowa and national Republicans wouldn't think he represents the will of the voters. Two unbelievable things there. First, when Ron Paul was in second or third place, they said, oh, it's irrelevant, he's in second or third. Now that he's winning, they're like, well, if he wins, then the whole caucus becomes irrelevant. But not only that, she says that he would not reflect the will of the Iowa voters. But if he won, he just won the vote. They would have just voted in Iowa. They would have selected Ron Paul. But ahead of time, the Republican establishment is saying, well, if the voters vote that way, they must not have meant it. It's mental. It makes no sense. But they keep on continuing. The Iowa House Speaker, Craig Polson, says, I don't think any candidate perverting the process in that fashion helps the caucuses in any way. You know what he's referring to? The fact that he's got a lot of people on the ground who support him and hence will go vote for him. But that's the whole point of the caucus. When Obama did that in Iowa, everybody went nuts like, oh my God, look at all this enthusiasm on the ground that he has. It wasn't perverting the process back then. And look, I supported Obama. So again, I'm not on Paul's side here in terms of politics. But when you look at it, it's outrageous to say that if he does what every other candidate has done in Iowa, it would pervert the process. They can't stand this guy. Now we go to one other guy, a pretty important guy in Iowa, the governor, Terry Branstad, of course, another Republican. He says, people are going to look at who comes in second and who comes in third. If Romney comes in a strong second, it definitely helps him going into New Hampshire and the other states. So wait a minute, let me get this right. When Ron Paul was in second or third, it was irrelevant being in second or third. When Ron Paul is winning, well, then who wins is irrelevant, and you got to look at who came in second or third? Third? What are we talking about, third? This is the dumbest thing I have ever seen in my life because they're scared to death of Ron Paul. All right, now here comes Sam Clovis, who's apparently an influential talk radio host in Northwest Iowa. He says, I think a Paul win would be devastating for the state of Iowa and the caucus process. Now, here's my favorite part. You see the political writing there at the end? He endorsed Rick Santorum on Monday. But wait a minute, Rick Santorum has less of a chance of winning the nomination overall than Ron Paul does. He does much worse in Iowa, New Hampshire, and in every other poll nationwide. So if Santorum wins, why wouldn't it disqualify Iowa then? No, Santorum's okay, but not Ron Paul. He'll stop the corruption. And then finally, Tamara Scott, who's Bachmann's state co-chair, who earlier was talking about how great and important Iowa caucuses were while Bachmann was leading. She says now, to see the process hijacked would be a concern for those who consider the honor we have of being the first in the nation. In other words, if Ron Paul wins, somehow he has hijacked the process. This is crazy talk, man. The establishment, especially the Republican establishment, can't stand Ron Paul because he would end business as usual, for better or for worse. Now let's bring in an expert on this. He is Tom Bevan. He is the co-founder and executive director of RealClearPolitics.com. He's also written the book, Election 2012, The Battle Begins. Tom, welcome to the Young Turks.
Hey, Jen, great to be with you.
All right, great to have you here. So first, obviously, moved on this Ron Paul issue. But, you know, what am I missing here? What has the mainstream got figured out on why we shouldn't pay attention to Ron Paul, even if he wins everything?
No, I think everything you said is pretty much right. I mean, the Republican establishment is panicked. There is a lot of cognitive dissonance going on with respect to Ron Paul. He is now leading in the polls. This is something that, and he is. He's well organized on the ground. That's what, you know, wins Iowa. He's climbing the polls in New Hampshire, and yet there is a sense among, you know, all of the sort of punditocracy, the consultants, that Ron Paul has no chance of winning the nomination. And part of it is because they don't really see a path for him necessarily beyond these early states. I mean, I guess it's possible, but you know, look, I think the establishment is scared of Ron Paul because he is outside of the establishment clearly in a way that, you know, people like Rick Perry and some of these other folks who are running as outsiders are not. I mean, he has views that are outside, I think, the mainstream of the Republican Party on foreign policy and on some other issues like legalizing, you know, marijuana and some of those things.
So,
but
Tom,
they do very much like what he says on fiscal matters and the debt and the deficit.
Yeah, and what's appealing to voters is cutting to $1 trillion, talking about being true to the Constitution. Those are things that appeal to Republican voters, and I get that. That makes sense. If you're a conservative, that should appeal to you. So, Tom, but no one has a pathway. That's the problem. I mean, you guys in your book, you cover all the Republican candidates, right? And when you look at him, Newt Gingrich, you know, who is still nominally leading, although he's been plummeting in the polls, still leading by about 2 points nationwide. Everybody thinks he's a disaster. Almost every conservative has spoken out against Newt Gingrich, from George Will to the National Review, et cetera, et cetera. When you look at Mitt Romney, the guy can't get above 23% in any poll. Every time they look at Mitt Romney, they don't like what they got in Mitt Romney. So who the hell's going to win this thing?
You know, that's a great question. I don't think we know. I think it's wide open. And you know, we've run a few pieces on Real Clear Politics recently about, look, I think it's still a long shot, but the idea of a brokered convention, of nobody getting the requisite number of delegates to win this thing. You're right. I mean, Mitt Romney's been running for president for 6 years. He spent millions and millions and millions of dollars, and he's still, 75 to 80% of the Republican base is looking for somebody else. Gingrich I mean, clearly he peaked too early. He's on the downswing now, but he didn't have the organization or the money to compete. You know, Santorum, Bachmann, they're not necessarily, they don't have that kind of organization. The only guy really is Rick Perry, who has the money, who has the staff, and has been putting things together. The question is whether he's going to get a second look here in the final 2 weeks from folks in Iowa and some of these other early states. He's starting to tick up in the polls, but I don't know if he's going to be able to reconnect with voters and you know, pull this out.
Right. First, let me just say one quick thing, then I want to ask you a final question. Yeah, you know, Rick Perry, if he wasn't such a terrible debater and such a terrible campaigner, would actually have a really good chance because he has money. He is a real wild-eyed conservative in a way that appeals to these primary voters. He has a decent story to tell on jobs. but he just can't seem to get it together. Every time you see him in a debate, and you're like, wow, this guy sucks, right? So he's got massive issues. But final question for you is, if Ron Paul is #1 in Iowa at this point, 2 weeks before the election, he's #2 in New Hampshire 3 weeks before that election, and you go to a brokered convention, wouldn't Ron Paul be sitting on incredible leverage even if he doesn't win the nomination?
Sure, sure. A lot of those folks would be. Again, remember, the other thing I like to point out about Iowa, which is, in some respects, there is this double standard with Paul, certainly. Whether he was going to finish second or third, ignore him. Now, if he's going to win, ignore him. But there is this, Iowa is very much about expectations in the sense that if Ron Paul is leading in the polls and he wins Iowa, that's fine, that's good for Paul. But the real story may be, if a second-tier candidate like a Bachmann or a Perry, who's polling at 8 or 9%, rockets up, outperforms expectations and gets to 17 or 18% and finishes third. In the same way that Bill Clinton in 1992 didn't win New Hampshire, but declared himself the comeback kid, and that propelled him forward in the process. That's
right.
What we might be seeing coming out of Iowa.
Yeah, I mean,
so it's an expectations game.
Right, and things are so crazy, even Rick Santorum has a chance. Who thought that could ever happen, right? All right, Tom Bevan from Real Clear Politics. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. Now, when we come back, we're going to go back into the story of North Korea and Kim Jong-il because